All right, good morning. Sorry, good afternoon. This morning, as you heard, the Secretary General spoke at the UNRWA pledging conference here at headquarters. His message was clear, is that there is no alternative to UNRWA, which is the backbone of our humanitarian operations in Gaza, and he called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held in Gaza. Mr. Guterres noted that the 195 staff members that have been killed, UNRWA staff members that have been killed, and that this is the highest staff death toll in UN history. Despite these and other obstacles, the women and men of UNRWA have bravely continued their work in whatever area they can. For his part, Mr. Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, sounded the alarm that the agency's ability to operate beyond August depends on member states disbursing planned funding and that making new contributions to the core budget. As a reminder, for the occupied Palestinian territory emergency appeal, driven primarily by the conflict ongoing in Gaza, UNRWA is appealing for $1.2 billion to cover critical humanitarian needs until the end of the year. This appeal and the emergency appeal for Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan are less than 20% funded. And of course, as you know, Mr. Lazzarini will be here in this room at 5:30 p.m. to brief you on the outcome of the meeting. As for the situation on the ground, our colleagues from OCHA took part in a mission to 3 sites in Gaza City today to assess the needs of people displaced in the wake of the latest evacuation directives given out by Israel. That mission was led by the Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator for the OPT, and that is Scott Anderson. Along with him was UNRWA, UNICEF, UN Mine Action, the UN Department of Safety and Security, and the NGO Acted. The team said those displaced urgently need food, water, health care, and protection. They also witnessed how lack of fuel is undermining the aid organization's efforts to provide critical service to displaced families. As you know, there has been a power outage in Gaza since October. The grid has not been functioning. Therefore, as you can imagine, hospitals, bakeries, water treatment plants, hygiene facilities, all are operating with generators that require fuel to be shipped in. OCHA reports that they tell us that they tell us that the active hostilities, damaged roads and access restrictions, and lack of public order and safety continue to prevent aid organizations from obtaining adequate supplies of fuel. Movements along the main humanitarian cargo routes between Karim Abu Salam crossing and central Gaza remains extremely difficult. As a result, only a quarter of the fuel supply needed to sustain humanitarian operations this month have been accessible in Gaza as of Wednesday. Turning to Yemen, the Secretary General earlier this week sent a message of solidarity to UN personnel in Yemen, and he told them that we remain profoundly concerned about the well-being of our Yemeni personnel from the UN, national and international governmental organizations, diplomatic missions, civil society, and other partners that have been arbitrarily detained by the Houthi de facto authorities. It's now been over a month since the majority of them were arbitrarily detained, although 4 of our UN colleagues have been detained as far back as 2021. Our senior officials continue to work through all possible channels to secure the immediate and unconditional release of those arbitrarily detained. We urge the de facto authorities in Sana'a to immediately and unconditionally release all of them. We further request that they are treated with full respect of their human rights and that they're able to contact their families and, of course, their legal representatives. We and our national and international NGO organizations, diplomatic missions, civil society, and other partners, personnel should never be targeted, should never be arrested, or should never be detained while carrying out their mandate for the benefit of the Yemeni people that they serve. Lastly, echoing the Secretary General's own words, that once again we express our deep appreciation for the invaluable work done by our UN personnel and those of our partners to try to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. And turning to Sudan, just a quick humanitarian update for you. And our OCHA colleagues say they're deeply concerned about a surge in displacement due to the ongoing fighting in Sennar State, which is in the southeast of the country. Yesterday alone, armed clashes in the village of Mayorno forced about 100 families to flee their homes. That's what authorities, local people are telling us on the ground. Civilian casualties have unfortunately also been reported. The International Organization for Migration says more than 150,000 men, women, and children in Sennar have been forcibly displaced both inside and outside the state since the 24th of June. We and our partners are supporting those who have fled the fighting in Sennar. So far, the World Food Program has provided assistance to nearly 46,000 people displaced to Blue Nile State, further south, as well as some 3,000 people who have fled the neighboring Guterres state. WFP says the fighting in Sennar signals an alarming spread of the conflict eastward towards Port Sudan. OCHA and all of us here at the UN once again underscore that the parties must de-escalate immediately, uphold their obligations under international law, international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and to the transport of humanitarian goods. Going west to Mali, I can tell you that we, along with our partners, continue to support the government-led humanitarian response despite access and funding constraints. Our humanitarian colleagues estimate that during the first quarter of the year, they were able to assist 600,000 people. However, needs continue to rise amid an influx of refugees and asylum seekers, mainly from Burkina Faso, as well as because of the start of the lean season. Our humanitarian colleagues note that more than 1.3 million people in Mali are suffering from acute hunger. That relates to IPC Phase 3 or higher. This includes more than 2,500 people who are facing catastrophic conditions at IPC Phase 5. According to government figures, more than 330,000 people in Mali are internally displaced as of the end of May. Although overall displacement has decreased slightly since the start of the year, it's still rising in some parts of Mali. This includes areas impacted by insecurity in northern and eastern Mali, including Bandiagara, Gao, and Menaka. The vast majority of those displaced, that's about 86% of them, are women and children. Our humanitarian colleagues stress that stepped-up funding for the humanitarian response in Mali is, of course, critical, as is an improvement in the security situation that will allow aid organizations to access and deliver assistance to people in hard-to-reach areas. 6 months into the year, the $700 million humanitarian response plan is less than 19% funding, with about $130 million received so far in the bank. That's the equivalent of some Major League Baseball rosters for the year. Our colleagues from Peacekeeping Mission in the CAR are telling us about their efforts as part of a community violence reduction project to rehabilitate a number of bridges in the Kemo and Ouam-Fafa prefectures. The initiative aims to help people move freely. As you can imagine, it's also helped to facilitate patrols in the movement of peacekeepers and security forces to boost protection of civilian efforts, including in isolated areas. Identified as priority by community leaders, the rehabilitation of bridges has also reduced accidents and brought much needed relief to impacted communities. Just to flag a couple of Security Council things. This morning, the Council voted to extend the mandate of our political mission in Haiti, and I can tell you that the Secretary General welcomes the unanimous adoption of that resolution, and that's 2743, extending the mandate of our political mission in Haiti. Following the vote of the Security Council, heard a briefing by the head of the UN Office for West Africa and the Sahel, Leonardo Santos Shimao. He will be available to you at the stakeout as soon as I'm done here. And yesterday, Carlos Ruiz Massieu, the head of the UN political mission in Colombia, briefed the Council on the situation in the country, noting that the peace process that has inspired the world and brought historic progress to Colombia is now facing challenges. And staying in the hemisphere in Hurricane Beryl, our humanitarian colleagues, including teams from the Humanitarian Department, from the UN Disaster Assessment and Coordination, continue to ramp up the response to work with authorities in Grenada, St. Vincent's and the Grenadines, Jamaica to complete assessment of the damage. We're also supporting delivery of food, plastic sheeting, hygiene kits, among other supplies. In St. Vincent's and the Grenadines and Grenada, access to remote islands continue to be challenged due to limited electricity, impassable roads. The islands of Cariaco and Petite Martinique and Grenada lack electricity, which is obviously hampering operations and, of course, communications. There's an urgent need for generators there. Due to damage to emergency shelters on some of the smaller islands, people are seeking refuge in schools and churches. Meanwhile, evacuations to the mainland of St. Vincent's and the Grenadines is ongoing. I also want to flag that the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, is in Guatemala from the 16th to 19th of July. There he will meet senior government officials and state officials, including President Arevalo, as well as members of the Judiciary, Congress, and the Ombudsperson. Mr. Turk will also meet with indigenous leaders, civil society groups, as well as victims of human rights. If you have colleagues in Guatemala City, there will be a press conference on 19 July. And turning to Ukraine, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says escalating fighting along the front lines in the east and the south of the country continue to impact communities. Our humanitarian colleagues tell us that yesterday strikes in the Donetsk region and eastern Ukraine resulted in casualties on both sides of the front lines. That's what the Ukrainian administration and Russian-installed authorities are informing. Multiple homes and education facilities were damaged. Aid organization immediately mobilized emergency support, including by providing bottled water and material to cover the damaged homes. Meanwhile, in the south, an interagency convoy delivered 4 truckloads of food, hygiene supplies, clothes, and other essential items to the frontline communities of Milov and Kherson region. Our humanitarian colleagues note that civilian infrastructure in the areas have been severely damaged by ongoing hostilities since 2022. And today it's an interesting day. It is the International Day for Combating Sand and Dust Storms. Sand and dust storms present formidable and widespread challenges to achieving 11 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, crucial to the Earth's biochemical cycles and influenced by human activities like unsustainable land management and water use. Sand and dust storms also contribute to climate change and pollution. No money. So, Edie, go ahead.
Thank you, Steph. First, a couple of follow-ups on Yemen. Is anybody from the UN actually talking to any senior Houthi officials?
Our colleagues from the country office are doing whatever they can in touch with the right officials to try to secure the release, or at least get some updates and visits, secure updates and visits to our colleagues that are being held.
And a second question. I believe it was last week that it was announced that one of the former political leaders who'd been imprisoned by the Houthis for quite a number of years was going to be released. Is there any update on whether he is?
Not yet. I don't have any update on that. But
And okay, my question is about all of these bodies being pulled from under the rubble in Gaza City following the evacuation of Israeli troops from some areas. At last count, there were at least 60. Does the Secretary General have any comment on this?
Yet another tragic example of the toll on civilians, on the people of Gaza that this conflict is having. And also, it shows the fact that while this conflict is going on, it is not only impossible to give people the medical support they need, the food they need, the shelter they need, but also the dignified burial that they need, those who've been killed at least. Michelle.
Thank you, Steph. On Sudan, do you have any update on the talks today? Did 1 or 2 people show up?
I do not have a count, as you would say, of people. But what I can tell you, yeah, I know. What I can tell you is that our personal envoy, Mr. Lamamra, and his team are continuing the discussions. They'll be working over the weekend with each of the two delegations. The discussions are going to take place different formats, different places. I mean, the point is that we remain in touch with both delegations. And, you know, I mean, and I think as I've outlined in pretty stark terms, the humanitarian situation in Sudan is deteriorating every day with a just horrific impact on the civilian population. There's so many people we can't get to, so many people who are not getting the assistance that they need. What Mr. Lamamra and the Secretary General and the whole of the UN wants is really for the Sudanese delegations to rise up to the challenge and engage in constructive discussions with Mr. Lamamra for the sake of their own people, for the sake of the Sudanese people and the needs of the Sudanese people, the suffering of the Sudanese people, and the effort to alleviate that suffering is at the forefront of our work and is our guiding principle. Gabriel and then Mike.
Thanks, Steph. A couple housekeeping things and a question. In Sudan, just to be clear on the talks, are both parties in Geneva and only one is participating in the talks, or is there only one of the parties that's actually in Geneva?
Both. There are representatives of both parties in Geneva.
Okay, thanks. Also, you said the OSHA delegation visited 3 sites in Gaza City. Do you happen to have more detail
No,
on that?
as I was reading the note, it was my question as well. We'll try to get you that.
No problem. If there's a chance for a briefing from the folks that were on this next week, that'd be great. It's rare to get. And then one more housekeeping, then a question. Let me just go to the question. Following up on Edie's question, Israeli forces have withdrawn from this area in Gaza City. Civil defense, as Edie correctly pointed out, are saying numbers of 60 dead civilians or 60 people, including initial reports of children and elderly. It seems like it's more than just a tragic toll on civilians. This was an occupying force that is withdrawing from an area, and it feels like they're asking for the UN to investigate immediately. What can the UN do?
Our primary aim right now is on the humanitarian part, right? To ensure that the people in Gaza get the aid that they need. I mean, you're talking about our aim today. We also want the parties that are engaged in very high-level discussions on a ceasefire, on the freeing of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas and others. We want those parties, like I've just said for Sudan, to rise up to the challenge, to have the political and the political will and the courage to reach an agreement so the fighting stops, right? Once the fighting stops, there will be a need for accountability, and there are different mechanisms, whether under the UN auspices. But right now, people are hungry. People need water. People need medical help, and that's what we're trying to do in the middle of a combat zone. Mike.
Sir, the UN Human Rights Office informed me this morning that the UN paid for the trip of Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese to Australia and New Zealand last year. It's been a long-standing question. During that trip, Ms. Albanese said Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas was, quote-unquote, non-existent. She attended a fundraiser, not for the UN, but for an outside lobbying group. And she also, according to internal documents, lobbied a New Zealand wealth fund to further divest from Israel. Considering the UN Human Rights Office can't keep its doors open because it has no money, I mean, why in the world is the UN funding this sort of trip for a special rapporteur?
Special rapporteurs, and I will say it again, and you know it, but I think it bears repeating, do not work for the Secretary General. He does not appoint them. He has no authority over them. It is part of a mechanism, of a human rights mechanism. They have access to a budget through Geneva. It is not for me to condone whatever the special rapporteurs do or say. The Secretary General's own position, I think, has been made very clear since October 7th. I think you've been in the briefings, you know that, and I will restate it. But again, these special rapporteurs are part of a human rights mechanism that does not flow from the Secretary General.
The UN, though, is begging, and in many cases, rightfully so, is begging for money. How does the UN, how does the Secretary General justify spending tens of thousands of dollars?
The Secretary General did not spend the money, right? It is, you need to.
How does he lay out the case for being a good steward of donors' money when this type of thing is happening?
I think the Secretary General is a very good steward of the UN budget that is under his responsibility, right? We've seen the budget cuts that we've had to make. Again, this comes under the overall human rights budget of the UN, and it's not under the authority of the Secretary General.
Second question for you related to this, although I assume the answer will be the same. The Coordination Committee on Special Procedures issued a statement on May 16th saying any allegations against Ms. Albanese in regards to this matter were unfounded and essentially in bad faith. The OIOS investigation into the matter has been turned over to that same committee to investigate. It's like having a jury pool made up of people who have already said the defendant is innocent before the trial starts. Any comment on how this kind of circus works?
There are different systems of accountability. Different people in this organization are accountable to different parts of the system, many of which are not under the authority of the Secretary General. If anyone misuses UN funds in any part of the system, there needs to be accountability, and it needs to be done after a thorough investigation. Edie, and then we'll go because I think Mr. Shimao is waiting at the stakeout for your questions.
Okay, a quick question following up on Gabriel's question. Mr. Laramra yesterday invited both parties to talks today in Geneva. Did both parties turn up at these talks? Your statement wasn't clear on this.
The discussions are being, let me just put it this way. Both parties are in the beautiful city of Geneva, right? Mr. Lamamra is in the beautiful city of Geneva. He is in touch with both parties. Those discussions are happening under different formats in different locations.
Does that mean, that says to me that both parties did not show up for these talks
Frankly,
this morning?
where whether I answer your question in the briefing room or I answer your question in the hallway, I'm still answering your question. That's the important part, is that he's talking to both.
Okay, and another very short question. Has the UN received any information from the United States about what they're going to do with the US peer?
None that has been relayed to me. Not everything is relayed to me, but I will ask. Bon weekend, all of you.